Hello, I'm the Past Master and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to have another blast from the past, as I promised you yesterday. We're going to talk about a second terrible tyrant that I have called Hungry Harry. So Hungry Harry is my epithet for Henry VIII, one of our most famous kings. And of course, hungry, greedy, fat. That's how a lot of people see Henry, although the fat came late in his life after a jousting accident. Before his jousting accident in the 1530s, he was mobile, fit, and probably quite an attractive, athletic 6'2". After the accident, he became known for being massive, a kind of original dandy, desperate Dan, a pie man, as we might think, appropriately enough, because in fact pies became popular in England in the 1520s during the reign of Henry VIII. So Henry did have a big appetite, particularly a big appetite for meat. He was very fond of his birds. For example, he would eat teal, cygnet, gull and shoveler. He also loved to eat the fruits of his hunting, so he liked to have his venison, and yes, probably like Desperate Dan, he liked a good cow pie as well. So that's one thing that you can say about Henry. He had a colossal appetite and probably exceptionally bad breath, because eating a diet that's protein rich, that's a lot of meat, does lead to halitosis, and people probably kept a wide berth when they could. Now, Henry's hunger for food may have made him famous, but it wasn't particularly important to his reputation as a rotter. So it was other hungers which have really made Henry stand out as a bad guy. The most famous, perhaps, is his hunger for wives. Henry VIII was desperate to produce a male heir. He was so desperate that he was prepared to break with the Church of Rome, make himself Pope. Perhaps for a man with his ego, this was not a big leap, but anyway, he was prepared to do that, and he was prepared to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and offend in the process her nephew, the most powerful man in Europe, Charles V. So Henry VIII made this great leap of faith, which was so different from the leap of faith that had made him the Pope's champion and fidei defensor a few years earlier. He made this great leap of faith in 1533-4, and he then determined that it was a boy at all costs. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. He worked his way remorselessly through 6 wives, most of whom met a somewhat unpleasant fate. Even his favourite wife, who produced him the son, Jane Seymour, died in childbirth. So in terms of women and in terms of romance, perhaps Henry VIII didn't do terribly well. One of his other wives he described as the Flanders mare. He'd married her based on a photograph, so perhaps that's a warning, not a photograph, a picture. Perhaps that's a warning to all of you who might be relying on images in order to pick your perfect partner. Now, Henry VIII, he also provoked a lot of danger for the country. So Charles V might have decided to invade England. In reality, Charles V had a lot of other problems to deal with. But Henry VIII was terrified that that would happen. And he spent money, lots and lots of money, on defending the country, building brand new grand boats, ships like the Mary Rose, which of course sunk without trace, and building new fortresses to protect his people. This is what divorcing Catherine of Aragon had got him, a form of paranoia. And the paranoia extended beyond just defending the country. It extended to forcing everyone to swear their allegiance to him and creating an enormous quantity of death. Henry killed a lot of suspicious characters during his reign. Popularly, he gave 2 hated tax collectors the chop at the start of it, but later on he worked his way through many of the so-called great and good of the nation. The Duke of Northumberland, the Duke of Norfolk almost got the chop, but ironically was saved by Henry's death. He was for execution, but he outlived the king in 1547. So Henry's head count was truly impressive, like a good horror movie. It was the consequence of his paranoid fear of invasion and of rebellion. Now, in order to protect himself, to protect his country, and to live the lavish, expensive lifestyle that he wanted, Henry VIII had to find colossal quantities of cash. His father had done him a few favours when he inherited, but later on in his reign he discovered another good way of bringing his enemies to heel, rewarding his friends and feathering his nest. And that was known as the dissolution of the monasteries. So from 1536 to 1541, he executed a plan to destroy the old fabric of monastic life, to destroy the hospitals and schools which had been created, and to bring the money that he gained from this into his purse and into the purses of his robber barons. So a great example of this is what happened at Laycock Abbey in Wiltshire. The new order, the robber baron who was fortunate enough to get his hands on Laycock, planted his new house on the foundations of the old abbey. That was the kind of vision that Henry had of the supremacy of his new secular order over the old religious one. Now, Henry VIII was clearly not going to get away with this without upsetting quite a few people. And indeed, there was a rebellion against him provoked by the dissolution of the monasteries. It was called the Pilgrimage of Grace. And a large number of people, mainly from the north and mainly commoners, led by someone called Robert Aske, a lawyer, they marched against the king's evil counsellors and they set out to persuade the king to change the policy. Unfortunately, they were naive, perhaps idealistic in their views. They believed that this was all cooked up by the king's counsellors. The king and his allies fobbed them off with false promises and then mopped up, increasing the head count later on when the band of fighters had dissolved. So Henry was pretty cynical, perhaps, with his promises there. He knew what he wanted: colossal quantities of cash and an iron grip on the people of England. So any bad tyrant probably deserves a bad end, and Henry VIII was no exception. History books like to dwell on the prophecy that monks made that Henry would have his body, his wounds, whatever, his sores, licked up like Lazarus's sores had been licked by the dogs in the Bible story. And in fact, although Henry died in his bed with no dogs present, as far as I'm aware, the strange thing was this story actually came to pass. So Henry died. He was a mass of pustules and horrible smells. So unfortunately, some people, like his wife, had to be there, Catherine Parr, and probably everyone was trying to avoid being the bringer of doom. If you told the king he was going to die, just like with the death of Stalin in the Soviet Union, you probably had it in the neck. But anyway, die he did in 1547. He was placed in a coffin, and in the coffin his remains exploded and started to ooze out. And this is when the dogs got busy. So in 1547, Henry left the nation of England with a legacy of unfinished reformation, an enormous legacy of dead rebels, and a quite impressive string of ex-wives. Well, that's all from me today. Thank you for watching, and please do watch my other video about King John and let me know in the comments section which of the two rotters was worse.